Welcome back to the deep dive.
Good to be here.
So today we're diving into something really fascinating and incredibly timely as well.
Mm.
The evolving relationship between the United States and Bangladesh, especially now as we're sort of marking the one-year anniversary of what some people are calling Bangladesh's Monsoon Revolution.
Right, that whole intense period.
Exactly. And our source material for this deep dive is this really insightful piece by Jon Danilowicz. It's titled Of July and Revolutions, published by Counterpoint.
Yeah, I read that. It's quite a take.
It really is. And our mission, as always, is to quickly try and dig out the most important nuggets, the surprising facts maybe, from his analysis.
To give you that kind of quick but thorough understanding.
Precisely. And it's interesting because the author, Danilowicz, he brings this unique perspective. He traces his deep interest in revolutions way back, actually.
To his childhood, right. The U.S. bicentennial.
Yeah, exactly. Memories of America's bicentennial. It kind of sparked this whole thing for him.
And that personal connection, I think that's a really critical starting point for understanding his angle here.
How so?
Well, the article really offers a U.S. perspective on these, very complex events. It grounds the whole discussion in that specific viewpoint right from the start.
Okay, right. So it's important to keep that frame in mind.
Definitely. It's looking at a dynamic situation through a particular lens.
Yeah.
Based on his experiences.
Okay, so let's unpack this then. Danilowicz kicks things off by really framing it through that personal connection. You mentioned the American Revolutionary War history.
Mm-hmm. Massachusetts, the bicentennial.
Right. He talks about how that lit this lifelong fascination with other big revolutions around the world. France, Russia, even Ireland.
So he's clearly not just like a casual observer. He's studied this stuff.
Seems like it. A deep student of revolutionary change itself.
And what's fascinating, I think, is that he openly acknowledges right up front that there's this ongoing debate
about whether July 2024 in Bangladesh was actually a revolution in the academic sense.
Exactly. Among historians, political scientists, But he makes a conscious choice. He says, look, let's set that debate aside for now.
Okay. So what does he focus on instead?
He explicitly says his focus is on recognizing the sacrifice of the brave students and citizens who were able to topple a tyrant.
Ah, okay. So that tells you a lot about his perspective.
Right away. His stance, his maybe emotional investment. The emphasis is on the human element, the cost, and the outcome, not a dry definition.
And thinking about the before picture, before those events in July 2024, the situation in Bangladesh, as the source describes it, it sounds pretty tense.
Stark is a good word.
Yeah.
The article highlights that the Hasina regime treated the United States and its representatives with open hostility.
And why was that?
Because of U.S. support for democracy and human rights, according to the piece. That created real friction.
So that kind of deep-seated antagonism, it's not just a footnote, it's like critical background.
Absolutely critical. And that's where he brings in that famous quote, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
George Santayana.
That's the one. He uses it to really underscore why it's so important to remember what Bangladesh looked and felt like before July 2024.
To understand the present efforts.
Exactly. To fully grasp what's involved in trying to build what he calls Bangladesh 2.0. It implies this, comprehensive reset politically and economically.
Right. Understanding the depth of the change they're aiming for.
You got it.
Okay, here's where, for me, it gets really interesting. The article talks about this incredibly surprising rapid turn of events in Dhaka. July, August 2024.
Things move fast.
Very fast.
Oh.
It notes the Biden administration was actually caught by surprise and that few in Washington had predicted that the student protests would lead to Hasina's downfall.
Yeah, it really seemed to come out of the blue for many observers, especially the speed and the final outcome.
A major geopolitical surprise.
Yeah.
But then despite that surprise, the U.S. apparently moved quickly.
Yeah, the article says the United States was quick to sense the opportunity that this change presented.
Opportunity for what? A reset.
A reset, exactly. The source details immediate support being provided to Chief Advisor Yunus.
The Nobel laureate who stepped in.
Right, him and his interim administration. And their initial goals were, well, pretty fundamental.
Like what?
First, preventing economic collapse, which was a real danger. Yeah. Then restoring law and order. And crucially, implementing reforms, political, economic, and order to actually pave the way for free and fair elections down the line.
So a rapid strategic pivot from the U.S. side.
Seems so. supporting this new direction for Bangladesh.
And the article points to this really symbolic moment that kind of set the tone.
Ah, the UN General Assembly meeting.
Yes. The warm embrace between Yunus and President Biden at the UNGA in September, that picture must have sent a huge signal.
Oh, absolutely. In international relations, optics like that are incredibly potent, especially after a period of, strained ties like the ones described.
It signaled clear endorsement.
Clear endorsement of the new administration, its goals. Reassurance both internally in Bangladesh and externally to allies. And the article notes it wasn't just the U.S.
Right. It mentions a broad international coalition of Bangladesh's friends echoing that support.
Indicating pretty widespread backing on the world stage for this transition.
Now, shifting gears a bit, for those of you who track this stuff closely, the talk around President Trump's anticipated return to office in January 2025, that definitely stirred up predictions about U.S.-Bangladesh ties.
Oh, yeah, there was a lot of speculation.
And the article touches on one common belief, that the relationship would suffer.
Right. The reasons cited were usually India's supposed influence or maybe a potential personality clash between the leaders.
That classic geopolitical guesswork. But did it actually play out like that?
Well, here's the interesting part. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the source says quite clearly those predictions have not come to pass.
Really? So the relationship didn't sour?
Apparently not. Instead, it says Washington and Dhaka have actually made considerable progress in redefining a new relationship.
Redefining based on what?
Based on individual and mutual interests. And the author uses this fascinating phrase to sum it up. America first has met Bangladesh first.
Huh. America first has met Bangladesh first. What does that imply?
It suggests maybe a more pragmatic alignment, where both countries found common ground, perhaps driven by practical benefits, that maybe went beyond those initial personality-driven predictions.
Finding mutual interest despite other potential friction points.
Seems to be the idea presented.
And the article gets specific about these shifts and also what stayed the same.
Right, it's not a total break.
It says the U.S. role as a leading development partner has changed, maybe shifted focus, but critical things like U.S. humanitarian assistance programs have continued.
That's important continuity. And also the military side.
Yeah, it mentions the military relationship continues to grow. And then there's this new economic angle.
Ah, yes, the exciting new chapter in bilateral economic relationships has opened.
So it's less about just aid, maybe more about partnership, a rebalancing.
That seems to be the direction, with new areas, particularly economic ones, coming to the forefront.
And this leads to what the author calls, wait for it, revolutionary development.
Okay, what's that?
The ongoing finalization of a new bilateral trade agreement between the U.S. and Bangladesh.
Ah, okay, that is significant. A formal trade deal.
Yeah, and the article really emphasizes its potential. It promises to provide a foundation for a dramatic expansion in trade and investment.
So moving beyond just aid, as you said, towards deep economic partnership, mutual prosperity as a core pillar.
Building longer-term, maybe more self-sustaining ties.
That would be the goal of such an agreement, typically.
Looking ahead then, what does the article say about keeping this positive momentum going?
Well, it points to the need for continued progress inside Bangladesh, specifically reaching consensus on the reform agenda.
Making sure those changes stick.
Exactly. And preparing for the elections planned for early 2026. Those steps, the article argues, are the foundation needed to really capitalize on these new opportunities.
Makes sense. Stability and reform unlock potential.
Precisely.
Now, this raises an important question, and the article gets into it. What about the people? Specifically, the diaspora.
Ah, yes. The Bangladeshi American diaspora. Their role is highlighted as pretty significant.
How so? What did they do?
Well, during the actual uprising, July and August 2024, they were apparently very active here in the U.S., protesting, advocating for freedom in Bangladesh.
So applying pressure from outside.
Seems like it. And what's crucial, the article stresses, is their continued commitment. They're still pushing for the ideals that motivated the July Revolution.
And connecting that to the U.S. relationship?
Yes, they have a passion for expanding U.S.-Bangladesh relations, and the article specifically mentions, in particular, in the areas of trade and investment.
So they're not just observers, they're actively trying to build those bridges, especially economic ones.
Active catalysts for change and stronger ties. That's the picture painted.
And this connects back, in a way, to the author himself.
His personal background again.
Yeah. He mentions being a child of immigrants who fled oppression and sought freedom and liberty in the United States. And he explicitly says he feels pride in standing behind those who want the same things: freedom, liberty for their birthland, Bangladesh.
So it brings that personal immigrant experience perspective right into his analysis of the current situation. A very impactful framing.
Definitely adds another layer to his viewpoint. So let's try and wrap this up. What does this all mean for you, the listener, and maybe for the bigger picture?
Well, I think the deep dive really showed the perhaps unexpected resilience of the U.S.-Bangladesh relationship after the Monsoon Revolution.
Yeah, it didn't collapse, as some predicted.
And it adapted, surprisingly, even with the change in U.S. leadership, sort of defying those initial forecasts.
And there's this promise now focused on mutual interests, especially expanded economic ties.
Driven significantly, it seems, by the energy and advocacy of the Bangladeshi American diaspora.
A really dynamic situation.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thought for you to consider, something to mull over. How does this idea of a revolution, whether you call it that formally or not, like the events in Bangladesh in July 2024, how does something like that actually influence the path, the strategic interests of nations?
Especially in their relationships with each other, like the U.S. and Bangladesh.
Exactly. On the global stage. And what does the author's choice, his focus on sacrifice, rather than getting bogged down in the academic definition? What did that imply?
For how we remember these events.
Yeah, for the future narrative, how we understand these kinds of massive societal shifts, maybe not just in Bangladesh, but elsewhere too. Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about. A focus on the human story versus the political science label.
Could be.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the really complex and evolving relationship between the U.S. and Bangladesh.
Always interesting.
Keep exploring, keep reflecting on these global dynamics, and we'll see you next time.